Thank you very much, Sarah. Sarah and I have been fast friends for quite a while. We rehearsed that, so she wanted to make sure that she got everything right and told me that there sometimes can be glitches in these introductions. That was perfect. Thank you so much. Generous introduction, actually. And thank you all for coming out tonight for this discussion. A work that I consider to be quite important, quite compelling for those of you who did see the documentary last week. Make sure I have this the right way, otherwise I'll be going backwards. To understand the context for the work that I'm doing, and also why this is such an important story in this moment. So what I want to cover, this is the art, the cover for the DVD. And as you can see, this is a piece that was an Emmy Award-winning documentary. I'll say more about that as we come up. But I just want to go through a little bit of what I want to try to talk about tonight with respect to the work and how I came about how I came into this project and what I'm trying to accomplish. So we'll talk about the connection to the work, how I got into it, something about the context for my work, and the story itself, a little bit about the story for those of you who haven't seen the documentary. Hopefully you will, and I understand it's available at the library, so do check it out. And then some elements of the story that apply through the context of the work that I do. With respect to discussion, we'll look a little bit at the purpose. What is it I'm trying to accomplish with this piece? And really with all the work that I do, including Emmett Till, and it might not seem apparent at first blush that there's a connection, but there really is. Some of the ideas that I'm trying to bring out in this piece and the approach overall that I'm taking. Okay, good. Often I can see the monitor right in front of me, so I just want to make sure that I'm not getting too far ahead of myself, and I am getting at least where I'm supposed to be. So a little bit about the piece itself. You can see here, you heard James Mall's, oh, thank you. Brilliant, thank you very much. I should have thought of that. But this is why you're here, right? So, yeah, there you go. So you heard the reference to James Mall. That's his picture there. And sort of a range of the work that he's done. James was the founding executive director of the Shoah Foundation. He is a protege of Steven Spielberg and part of the USC Mafia that came out, the filmmaking mafia. He's done quite a lot of work in documentary production, including the work on Voices of the List, which grows out of the Schindler's List story. If you have the DVD, if you've borrowed it, rented it, you know that there are extra features. This is one of the features. Survivors of the Holocaust is another one of his work. The Last Days, you'll see pictured there, which won him an Academy Award, another piece that's quite compelling, in which he takes 5 survivors, Holocaust survivors, back to Hungary, which, if you're familiar with the history, was probably the worst and most frantic period of the Holocaust, when the Germans knew they were losing the war and wanted to make sure that they got rid of all the Jews in Europe. So quite a compelling piece. And then finally we have Inheritance, yes. And the piece that I'm working on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got connected to it. But you can see in the range of his work, he's looking at compelling stories of the human experience, particularly as it relates to how we have come to see difference in our society and how we've come to enforce difference up to and including genocide. And again, there's a connection to the work that I'm doing. I met James basically through the Emmett Till Project. Having done work on the Holocaust, he wanted to develop stories that come from the American experience that are in conversation with the stories on the international stage that have some similarities. And so we talked for a while. You'll see a picture there of a group of us who met with Mamie Till Mobley in June 2002 and told her we wanted to make a motion picture out of her story. We decided at that moment that I would first write a book with her, and we'd use the book as the basis for the motion picture. So the Emmett Till film was the first step in this collaboration. And we moved on to some other projects as well while I was writing the book, and shortly after I wrote the book. I can't read the small. Okay, there we go. Running the Sahara. This kind of walks through my connection to James Mall. We're collaborating on the Emmett Till motion picture. He wants to direct. We're working together on the screenplay. Last year, I was selected by Sundance as a fellow based on the work I had done on the screenplay, so we're moving that along. James is quite a talented and wonderful collaborator. He brought me into this other project, Running the Sahara, which is quite an interesting documentary project with 3 world-class runners who decided that everything they had done up to this moment wasn't challenging enough, so they decided they were going to run across the Sahara, a marathon across the Sahara. And if you know anything about geography, you know that the Sahara is as wide as the United States. So it's an arid region in North Africa. They decided to do that. And he wanted me to come in. Matt Damon was the executive director. James wanted me to come in to help with the narration that Matt Damon was going to read in this documentary. So I had to find the theme, which we determined was the challenge that sort of represented the challenge of North Africa in finding and developing sources of potable water. So this story became something of a challenge for these guys running across the Sahara, but also representing the challenge that the indigenous people face every day in that region. And then there's this piece of the Foo Fighters. And you might wonder, well, how does the Foo Fighters documentary lead you to the Holocaust? Well, what happened was James, in his work, has won an Academy Award. He's won a number of Emmy Awards, Peabody. And when he did the Foo Fighters documentary, he wound up winning a Grammy. So in congratulating him for this victory, I said, well, you know what, you've won all these awards. You got an Oscar, a Grammy, all these other things. You've never won a Tony Award. And so we laughed about that and went on to some other things, but it kept percolating in my mind. I said, wait a minute, in all seriousness, forget about the awards. You have a compelling story here in Inheritance that I can see as a stage play, and I think we should talk about developing it. And he was, right away, he was taken with that, and we decided to begin working on it. He's going to direct, and I'm doing the stage play. So a little bit about the story for those of you who haven't been exposed to it. This is a story about 2 women. It grows out of the Schindler's List story. It's 2 women who were in conversation together. You see here some images of the Płaszów concentration camp in just outside Krakow in Poland. You can see an archival shot of the concentration camp, and if you saw Schindler's List, you saw the representation of it. And the color pictures are the more recent images of what is now a memorial and a nature preserve just outside Płaszów. So what you have here in this documentary is a conversation between a Holocaust survivor and the daughter of a perpetrator. And when James produced this documentary a few years back, this was the first time we'd actually heard from a child of the perpetrators of the Holocaust. And quite a unique story. Since that time, we've had other productions, including Hitler's Children, which goes into the trauma that these children have experienced. So we get an idea of the full range of destructive effect and enduring destructive effect of the Holocaust. So it's quite a compelling story just conceptually. You have a survivor in conversation with the child of a perpetrator. In this case, the perpetrator was the commandant of the Płaszów concentration camp, Amon Gert, who, as you saw portrayed by Ralph Fiennes in the movie, is absolutely insane. And he, not to minimize the suffering that he caused, he stands as a metaphor in many ways for the Nazi atrocities that unfolded. So James took them back to the Płaszów concentration camp, which is now a memorial ground, and brought them in conversation with each other. And in that conversation, we see the enduring pain, certainly of the survivor, but also the pain of the daughter of the perpetrator. And we get a chance to explore the dimensions of this trauma in both of these cases. So the challenge for me now is to find more of a story in this story, because a question always is posed when you're looking at adaptation, and that is, what more can you do with this story? It's already been told, and the documentary, for those of you who have seen it, is quite compelling. So you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why do you want to do any more? The story stands on its own. Recently, I wrote a piece for the New York Times on a rendering of the Emmett Till open casket shot, the iconic photograph of Emmett Till that his mother made possible because she wanted everyone to see what had been done to her son to effect some change. And it was quite controversial when a white artist did an abstract painting of that image. And the question, I did the piece for the New York Times, and I went to the Whitney in New York to do a presentation on it. The compelling question is, what more can you say about this image, about this experience that hasn't been said already? And how are you, in the discourse, the ongoing discourse now about who should be telling each of these stories, how do you explain supplanting the mother, whose grief is written all over that original image? So we always have to ask ourselves, if we're going to do something with a piece of creative work that's already been rendered, what more can we do? And so that's the challenge that I faced in terms of looking at what can be developed in this story. So part of my, my challenge is to discover more story in the story and to present new meaning out of the story. And what I found in looking at the documentary a gazillion times is that there is room for more discussion about some of the issues that arise from this story. So first of all, there is more story. I've been doing research, and it's an hour-long documentary, and there are hours of outtakes. So I've been exploring the interviews that did not make it into the documentary and finding other stories that could add more meaning to this experience for all of us. So that's part of it. I'm also talking to a psychiatrist. Yeah, I need help, but beyond that, this is a person in California who has seen the documentary and also counsels survivors, Holocaust survivors. So she's been helpful as I think of issues that are raised in this conversation, this interaction, and some of the surrounding issues. She's helpful in sort of navigating the feelings and the motivation of these people in coming together, and that certainly adds a dimension to the story. So I'm finding more story, more of the interview material. I'm also looking at other interviews of people who came out of Płaszów, the concentration camp, other survivors, and people who can tell stories about Jewish culture in Krakow before the Holocaust. So all of that comes together to inform the discussion that takes place between Helena Jonas, the survivor, and Monica Hertwig, the daughter of Aman Gert. So this is how I've approached this, and at a certain point, I've sort of moved beyond just the literal transcription, if you will, of all these interviews, and I begin filling in the blanks. What did they mean by this or that? What is it they're trying to convey? And of course, I take license to fill in those gaps. So a little bit about my work. My work is at the intersection of three different areas: critical race theory, media studies and communication theory, and narrative theory. Now, what does all that mean? With respect to critical race, making sure this is coming up, I look at social construction, okay? That's the point of departure for the Emmett Till story and everything else I've done since then. It's true in this case as well. What we're looking at with respect to social construction is difference, right? We're looking at social difference based on race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, all the things that we're seeing in our national discourse right now that are forming areas of conflict. This is where we enter into this conversation, social construction. But social construction is purposeful. When we form our identity in this society in oppositional terms, okay? I am good. I always want to be good and smart and good looking and all the positive attributes that we want to associate with ourselves. But in order to understand what good means, we have to contrast it with bad, right? Good can only can only have meaning if we compare it to something that's bad. So if I'm good, I have to compare myself in opposition to what is bad. And if I'm good, then the other is bad. The other is not smart. The other is not worthy, and all the other attributes that we can go through with respect to sorting ourselves and thinking more positively about ourselves than the other. And you can see how this plays out when you begin to look at the way we've come to see race and gender and sexuality and religion and age and ability on down the road. But this also is purposeful, because this is all about assigning rank in our society. And you can see it here if you can read that. We define ourselves in opposition in order to justify place in our society, privilege in our society, and as important as anything else, power in our society, right? So we have what amounts to a power hierarchy, okay, where certain people are always going to occupy the top, the apex of this little triangle, and everybody else is jockeying for position down below. And you can kind of see in the history of this country who tends to occupy that top perch in this power hierarchy, right? And it's by identity. So the whole point of identifying ourselves in oppositional terms is to justify this, to say that some people are worthy of those higher positions, either at the top or at some ranking position down below the top, in order to allocate the benefits of being in this society, or any society. It's not just American society. This is true of all societies across the globe. So the purpose of this is to assign this position in our society, and then we get to the enforcement, and that's what leads us to an understanding of Emmett Till as not just a bad act by some bad people, but as part of the enforcement of this power hierarchy, this socio-political hierarchy. The same is true of genocide. The same is true, obviously, of the Holocaust. So the enforcement of this hierarchy is through intimidation, through threat, and ultimately through violence. We tend to call that hate crime, but I don't think that hate crime goes nearly far enough, because hate crime tends to focus on individuals. In the case of Emmett Till, 2 people who come and kidnap him and torture him and eventually kill him. But it's really part of a societal structure. So ethno-violence, I think, comes closer to helping us understand that when these bad actors do these horrible things, they're part of a systemic problem in our society, and we need to look at it that way. So ethno-violence on an individual level up to and including genocide. And of course, we know that we're looking at the anniversary now of the Armenian genocide in Turkey. There's a film that's, I think it's out now, that deals with that. So we're looking at all of these expressions of power in our societies. So that's social construction, media studies, and communication theory. I deal with agenda setting. In my ethics and diversity class in journalism, we talk about the power of the media to set the public agenda, to tell us not only what is important to think about, but how to think about those things. And if you take a moment and look at television news, for example, you'll see that the headline story is important, right? It suggests to us that this is the most important thing to think about. But there are other aspects of that presentation that tell us how to think about those things. And if it's repeated day after day after day, then that's setting the public agenda. This is the thing you should be talking about. But how do you talk about it? This is where we get into framing. Everything that the media determine is important to us is going to go in that frame. This screen right here is a frame. Everything that I want you to know is right here on this screen, and stages, obviously. So the framing tells us not only what's important according to the editors and the producers, but it also, in a way, tells us what's not important, because only the important stuff is going to appear in the frame, right? Whether it's the front page of a newspaper, whether it's the cover of a magazine, or the headline story on CNN or Fox or wherever. But then what is excluded from the story? There are decisions made about what is going to come into the story, what is going to be left out of the story, everything we know. If you've never been to Syria, right, everything you know about Syria is in this frame, right? Because otherwise there's nothing that you can understand about it. Then we get to the representation. What are those things that are in the frame going to say to us? How are they presented to us? So issues and people are presented in certain ways that help us understand them in a distorted way or in a very clear way. But decisions are made somewhere along the line often on the basis of biases of the people who are putting this stuff together, to help us understand. We make meaning out of this. There's this whole notion of encoding and decoding. I'm not going to go into that. But ultimately, what I wanted to get to is this notion of mediated reality. Okay? Again, if you've never been to certain places around the globe, the only thing you know about those places is what you've experienced through the media. So your reality is not an experiential reality at all, because you haven't really experienced them. It's a mediated reality. So you can see all the ways that your understanding of issues, your understanding of people you've never met, is going to be shaped by the way the stories are covered and the way these issues and people are presented. Narrative theory really goes to sort of drawing all this together and looking at the thing that happens, right? There is an event. There is something that happens. But as important as anything else is our discussion of the thing that happens. How is that thing presented? And all these other elements come together in that. So this is how my work is shaped. I also deal with an inheritance, this notion of a narrative conflict, right? The conflict is formed in a way by the experiential reality as set against the mediated reality. You're going to see, if you've seen the documentary, you know that one of the women, the characters now in the story, has had the experience of the Holocaust and she survived. The other has been told certain things and only knows about the Holocaust based on this mediated effect. She has seen it through the lens of people who've told her stories, what she's read in well-edited books and so forth. And so we have a conflict there. And you see that conflict, those of you who saw the documentary, in an exchange in the House. Also, what I look at is this notion of value-added impact. Okay, so there's a story, a compelling story, and that's my point of entry. The Emmett Till story could stand on its own. This story could stand on its own just as a story. But what I look for is what it means. You know, what is the value-added impact? What do we take away from this story apart from the human connection to the story? What is going to help us frame a deeper understanding of the social structures that cause us to think in a certain kind of way and ultimately to act in a certain kind of way? Those are the things that I want people to take away from this work. Contemporary resonance, yeah. I also, I don't know if you've seen Hamilton, but there's a wonderful rendering of the historical event, but every now and then there are these little teasers of contemporary resonance. One line is that gets a lot of applause is in song is immigrants know how to get work done, and everybody is applauding at that. Well, obviously that's not something that necessarily was said back in colonial in revolutionary America, but it's a way of sort of connecting people to the reality that we are a nation of immigrants, right? And people applaud because they get that, but they also know how it applies to our contemporary moment. These are things that I'm looking for in this story as well, because while the Holocaust is a part of our history as well, there are things that we should be looking at that might remind us or might warn us of a reoccurrence of atrocities, right? We've suffered through apartheid in this country, atrocities that were committed against certain groups. What are we looking at right now that might remind us? I mean, we might like to think that we could never again be subject to the dictates of an authoritarian figure who is engaging in propaganda and wants to make our country great again. But it could happen. and the point is, as engaged citizens in this democratic society, we have a duty, don't we, to stand up and to be informed, certainly to have a critical appraisal of the media and look through the presentation of this material, to be engaged and also to get out and to participate. Whatever your politics are, that's not the point. It's how you get there. That's the point. And obviously, we want to make sure that we continue to do what we are responsible for doing. So where am I? Value, history. Okay, this is very important. History and memory. It's a theme in this piece. In fact, the opening. I was telling some people earlier the structure of it. I have a prologue. What I started out with was basically just two characters, two women, two wing chairs and a water table, and just a conversation. And I said, I'm just going to let this piece grow and develop and talk to me and tell me what it needs to do all the things that I've set out to do here. So I have other characters now. And among those characters, in the conversation between these older women, are renderings of them as younger people. Two younger women who serve as a chorus, basically, in the piece and help to interpret things that are going on and add a voice that would not be realistic if I put it in the actual characters. But in the very opening, the prologue, we have a provocative question. What is history? And these are the two younger characters. What is history? Is it the thing that happens, or is it our memory of the thing that happens? And right away, we're engaged in trying to determine, wait a minute, that's right, because whatever has been committed to some source, a book or what have you, tends to get revised over time, right? And a lot of that revision is based on interviews with people who have experienced these things. And you can see this again in the narrative conflict that unfolds in this story, with the experiential reality on the one hand, the mediated reality, what one person remembers, what one person has been told. What is history? What is the history of this horrible experience? So again, narrative theory comes in. There's the event, then also the discussion of the event. The discussion of the event depends on what it is we might remember about it. But the compelling piece of this is memory, particularly traumatic memory. And now, for those of you who haven't seen this thing, hopefully this will work. I have a piece of the documentary, the trailer, if I can cue it.
When Monica was a child, the only thing she knew about her father was that he had died in the war.
For me, he was everything, and everybody told me he was such a nice man and he would do everything for me.
When she was 13, she discovered the truth. Monica's father was Amon Get, a man responsible for the murder of thousands. There's one person still alive who knew him well. That person was once one of his victims, enslaved as his personal servant.
He was a monster. He had the urge to kill. To him, I was a dirty Jew.
I sent a letter to Helen. I always would have liked to meet her.
From Academy Award-winning director James Mall comes a story of two ordinary women with extraordinary courage.
She will be scared to see me. I know that. And I am scared to see her because of all her pain.
Those people here died because of one man, Amon Get. I understand how important it is for her and to find out the truth.
What I heard when I was a child, he only killed some Jews because of...
Monica, please, I have to stop you right now.
I think at least she should know that I'm not like my father.
Inheritance, a legacy of hatred, and the journey to change it.
It's quite a compelling story, clearly, and you see the elements of conflict right there in the trailer. And so what I wanted to point out to you are a couple of things. You can see, one, the frame of this, right? The legacy of hatred and the journey to change it. When you begin to, that's the frame of the documentary. When you begin to look at what I'm trying to do with the play, it's even larger than that, right? Because the framing of a legacy of hatred suggests individual wrongdoers. And what I want to focus on is the societal construct of this thing. So that's one area that we're working on. The narrative conflict, clearly with respect to these two women, is there. Now, they both have suffered. There's no question about it. You saw Monica's story kind of encapsulated in this presentation. To add a little bit to that, when she was a very young child in post-war Germany, she noticed that there were no men around, right? They had just come out of the war, so that was the nature of the families. There were few intact families there. So she asked, if all families had fathers, and she was told that she did have a father at one point. And here, the mediated reality, right? She was told that her father had died fighting for his country in the war. So she spent the next 8 years or so thinking that her father died as a war hero. It wasn't until she was 14 that she discovered what you saw there in the trailer, that her father actually had been executed as a war criminal. So she's traumatized as well. But think about all the stories that have been told after the war that framed the experience in different ways. And the story that you'll hear if you watch the documentary, eventually see the play, the way they have kind of rationalized the Holocaust is horrifying in and of itself. The rationale for killing people in the Jewish community. So that's her mediated reality. So we look first at Amengert and the mediated reality of Monica. He was such a nice man. He would do anything for me. I don't know why I have to sort of approximate her accent when I say that. But that's her reality. That's what she was told. She never knew her father. She was one when he was executed. She never knew him. She has only come to know him through the lens of other people, this mediated reality. And this is what she was told. That was the only thing she understood, as opposed to the experiential reality of Helena. If you saw Schindler's List, you know that Helena is the person who was brought into the house by the commandant, and he abused her. So her reality is quite different, and she says Amengert was a monster. She says quite a bit more in the documentary and in the outtakes. With respect to the Holocaust itself, you see this mediated reality of Monica that, as it unfolds in the documentary, is framed as something for social good, if you can imagine that. It's part of post-war German denial. But she absorbed that because she was part of that culture. And this gets into the psychology, right, of the people who were on that side of this horrific issue, and the way they've tried to rationalize, the way they've invented stories that carry us forward, and how that puts us in conflict. Obviously, the experiential reality of Helena is genocide, the attempt to completely annihilate the Jewish population. Oh, there it is. Sorry. It's really hard for me to read down there, but at least I know that things are coming up, so forgive me. So what are the elements of the story that I'm trying to present here? One, as I mentioned, I look for compelling narrative. I want a good story. Even you heard the reference to the Patti LaBelle piece. My job in coming to that as the editor was to always find some kind of pithy conclusion for each chapter that threaded the theme of this book throughout all the chapters, right? So there was a compelling story, but we also were looking for meaning. What did her story mean? And for those of you who are familiar with Patti LaBelle, it wasn't just the music. It was this anxiety of a person who thought she was never going to live to be 50 because so many people in her family had died before they reached that age. So how do you deal with that anxiety and the resolution of that, the happy ending, if you will? So that is the compelling story. The value-added impact of it is, again, the journey of a lifetime and the spiritual revelation that she experienced. Similarly with the Emmett Till story, Mamie Till Mobley's journey to justice, her ability to mine her grief for a mission in life that actually moved the entire country forward, because Emmett Till is the bridge between the way we were and the way we are with respect to the civil rights movement. With this story, we're looking at that intimate connection. And this is what I always try to find, that thing that connects us in a universal way, something we can relate to, even with people who might at first seem so remote from us. What are the points of connection that we can form? And then how do we expand that to take away some larger meaning? And I do this, and I know I must have a reference to this somewhere down the road. Oh, yeah, I do have it here. In the intimate story, you can see my notes here. I'm just going to keep talking. What we're looking at are things that we can relate to. There's guilt. There's responsibility. There's the guilt of the survivor. There's also the guilt of the daughter of the perpetrator, who feels some responsibility that flows from her, through her bloodline, right? And that's, I've also been studying organic German culture to kind of understand the thought processes that led to the Holocaust. And we know about eugenics, and that was certainly a widespread movement in Germany, this notion that you're born with certain things. And when you study the reality of the children of the perpetrators, you realize that they think they've inherited. Okay, this is why inheritance is such a great title here. They think they've inherited this evil gene, right, and that they could wind up doing things to hurt people as well. Some of them have had themselves sterilized. These are children. These are innocent people, basically. If they didn't benefit from the Holocaust, then you can say they're innocent. But they feel some responsibility. They feel that they too could do something horrible. And so you have those psychological aspects of this. Traumatic memory certainly plays into it, but these form sort of a universal point of connection. We can relate to these things. We understand these things. And when we see them play out with other people, we are drawn into their stories. But I try to take it farther than that with respect to the power relationships. And you can see that unfold in the play, certainly, as I'm developing it. But this notion of the enforcement of social difference. This is what the Holocaust was all about. This is what genocide is about in all the theaters of genocide around the world. In Central Africa, in the Balkans, in South America, in Asia, we see these things still playing out here. The outcome is that we should connect with this humanity, right, in ways that we can't when we deal with the overwhelming numbers that often are presented with these stories. And not to minimize the Holocaust, but when you're dealing with numbers in the millions, sometimes you can lose sight of the humanity, right? You're overwhelmed by the huge numbers. When you enter through the intimate story, you can relate to the pain and suffering that expands, it telescopes out to the magnitude of the problem, and that's what I'm trying to do with this piece. So just a note about my approach, which is characterized as literary nonfiction. We use the techniques of fiction to bring nonfiction, to bring real stories to life, right? And you can see here, I'm just going to put those up there quickly. Some of the elements are character, theme, voice, setting, conflict, and resolution. Yeah. So these are the things that I think about as I'm putting this story together. How does it arc as a dramatic piece? And in this case, the documentary has a certain kind of flow. And again, how do I add something to that? Well, one of the things I've done is kind of restructure it. At first, I started out, as I told you, with a minimalist approach. That has grown. In terms of the structure, I was looking at a 2-act play because I said, well, there's a setup and then there's the dialogue at the concentration camp. I've expanded it now. It's got a prologue, 3 acts, and an epilogue. But I also am moving stuff around because there's a flow that I need to establish as a dramatic matter that doesn't necessarily play out with the documentary. The same was true with the Emmett Till story. We didn't just start at the beginning of Mamie Till Mobley's life. She told me when I first sat down with her, she said, you know what, she was 80 years old when we met. She said, I can remember back when I was 3 years old. And I said, well, that's great, but that's not how we're going to start this story, right? But what we were able to do was to move things around in ways that could foreshadow or flash back to keep that narrative arc going. So that's one of the things I'm doing with this piece is moving certain things around that work better in different parts of the story. But what you have here are 2 characters, right? 2 relatable people who have pain, who have suffered, and we connect with them through that suffering, and we're engaged. They get into conflict because they have 2 different realities that have to be resolved in some way. That conflict rises throughout the presentation and carries us forward to the ultimate resolution. And when I figure that out, I'll come back and talk to you about that. But the resolution, goes to, in all seriousness, the nature of the title, inheritance. What is it that we have inherited from our forebears, and what is it we're going to pass along, which is the most important thing? This new awareness that these characters, these 2 women, reach in the course of their dialogue is going to inform us with respect to our responsibilities. We see them discover their own duty as engaged citizens of society. So again, these are the characters we're building. You see Helena and Monica there. You see Ray Fiennes as Amangert and the real Amangert in the corner there. You see Oskar Schindler, the real Oskar Schindler, and as he's portrayed in the movie. These will be people who also will be featured in one way or the other. Now, it's interesting. When I started out, I said, okay, as I started expanding and including more characters, I said, but they're not going to have speaking roles. They're just going to be silhouetted or whatever. Then they were just walk-ons without dialogue. Now I have them at least contributing something by way of dialogue to expand the story. So this is just the way I proceed. By looking at the bare minimum that I need to tell the story, right? The dialogue is compelling, but what else? If the dialogue was all I needed, then I could leave it in the documentary, right? What can I bring to this story? What can I add to this story that achieves the purpose that I've set out to achieve, and that is to find some structural elements that will inform us. But there's also a surprise, because this person emerged. This person is not in the documentary. Do you know? I hear some reactions here. Yes? Oh, okay, all right. Some people cheated. No, no. Some people looked ahead and saw that this person figures into the story because she is actually the granddaughter of Amangert. She is the daughter of Monica Hertwig. Monica, in struggling throughout her life, had a relationship with a student in college, a black African student, and out of that relationship, she had a daughter, Jennifer Tiga. And Jennifer Tiga wrote a book that's just been released in English in the United States, My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me, because she also, later in life, discovered, she's in her mid-30s now, she discovered the reality of her heritage and almost had a nervous breakdown as a result of that. You can imagine what an African German person would experience, realizing that they have this bloodline that connects them to Nazi atrocities. So she has written about this, and the issue is, as you can see here, it's not. You can see here. It's not in the documentary. So what is my duty as a storyteller? To go outside the four corners of this documentary. It's not just a literal transcription of the documentary. What do I need to tell the complete story? It's kind of hard to ignore that this is the reality of one of the characters. It does become a documentary play. So what do I do? And you guys can pitch in and tell me, what should I do? What should I do with this person here? What do you think? Okay, you can hold the thought and we'll come back to it. The point is that this is very much a part of the story. What does it mean in the context of this story? What does this person bring to our deeper understanding of the characters, if you will, in this play that moves us forward to understand the structures of social difference and enforcement, the violent enforcement of that? Certainly, there is something that can be said about it. I put this up here because James Mall went on to direct a documentary with Steven Spielberg for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it's a 15-minute documentary narrated by Meryl Streep. It's beautifully rendered. You can look it up. It's at the USC site where the Shoah Foundation is situated. And I put it up because it has a reference that Meryl Streep reads at the end of the piece. The past constantly reinvents and reasserts itself. The past is, in effect, present. And again, this is something I play with in the course of telling this story. You know, this notion of, the past, as some writers have said, the past which is actually written by the future, Or in 1984, of course, George Orwell plays with this concept as well, that the past, who controls the past also controls the future. I'm playing with these themes in order to expand on this notion of traumatic memory. You know, how is it that we come to conceive of those things that have happened in ways that inform our present and direct us to a better future? So these are the things I'll be thinking about as I conclude my work and try to bring these people to life and to a deeper understanding among us, not only of these people and their experiences, but our role as engaged citizens in our society. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions, and I know some people have done some research, so give me those hard questions. I'm ready for them, I hope. So thank you for your attention. Thank you. It'll be all right. Hello. There we go.
Well, I don't really want to be on the video. I just had one question that just came up is in the documentary, Monica's raising her grandson. Is that Jennifer's son that she's? No. Okay.
No.
Just curious about that.
Yeah, I got a little confused about that myself.
Okay.
She had another daughter.
Just curious as to, I mean, I was thinking about this the whole time, and then Meryl Streep's comment that she made at the end of that is something I struggle with. And I'm just wondering, what is your take? Like, are we getting better as a society, or are we getting worse, or are we the same? It's like, and, you know, I keep struggling with what we can do to change that.
Yeah. Well, I'm ever hopeful. You know, one of the reasons I'm a writer is because I can find that sort of motivational or hopeful message in some of these stories. I mean, we are, even in Emmett Till's piece, this kid was horribly tortured and mutilated, but we find some hope even in that story as we continue to struggle for justice. I just got back from Mississippi. It was my second trip in a month as we were exploring possibilities and reopening the case, the investigation of Emmett Till's murder. So in that, perhaps there is some hope. Yeah, I think we're better. We're better largely because of the information that we've accumulated on by virtue of our experience. But we still have a tendency to veer in the wrong direction, right? We're so easily manipulated by people who appeal to our emotions. I think, again, putting aside politics, but you can see it in the last administration, where there's always going to be opposition between one political party and the other. But you look at how that opposition was framed and how it was represented, and you begin to say, wait a minute, people are appealing to some of our baser instincts. And one of the things that I cover in teaching hate crime is that these acts of ethno-violence intensify in periods of fear, a fear of loss, a fear of change, a fear of you know, just something that seems threatening. And I track that through the last administration. It's interesting because one of the slogans of the Obama campaign was change, which appears to be a positive thing, but it was a threat to some people who couldn't navigate the change that we know is unfolding. We're standing on the cusp of a new demographic reality in this country, and that's a change that some people don't understand and they don't know exactly how to deal with. When I gave you the example of the pyramidal power or hierarchy, the thought that I was trying to put out there is that there is a certain group that has always presided at the top, and that's white men. And now we're approaching a period where there's not going to be a sort of a monopoly on power. We're going to have to deal with power sharing, and some people just don't understand that. So are we better? Yeah, I think we have access to more information. Are we using it effectively? It doesn't seem so. I tend to think that the period we're going through right now is probably the last gasp of this kind of reaction, and I think we're going to emerge from it much better. That's my feeling. Are people good people? Well, yeah, they're good people. They're bad people. But I think what we have to do is, particularly through the media, is to help people understand all these issues so that they can make enlightened choices. And my colleagues like to say we in the media should help people make informed choices, but you can watch, I don't know, Fox all day and you're going to have information. Is that necessarily going to make you enlightened? Or MSNBC, I'm not trying to slant it one way or the other. You're going to have a certain narrow focus of the information you have. We need to go out and seek wide sources of information so that we can begin to make more enlightened choices.
I'm going to swipe a question here myself. When I watched this documentary about, when it first came out, I rented it, and I watched another one called Forgiving Mengele that came out. Have you seen that one? And seeing the two of them together kind of brought into my mind a theme of forgiveness. And it was very controversial that this one Holocaust survivor was going around asking other Holocaust survivors to forgive Mengele. And some people could accept she was doing this, and other people were outraged. But in this situation, does Monica require forgiveness? Has she done anything that needs to be forgiven? Did Helena, feel that she should ask for forgiveness? Did Helena decide that, feel that she needed to forgive her? And if she did forgive her for what? It's an interesting problem.
It is, and I did a presentation at Hillel down at our campus where we screened the documentary and I talked at the same, right after. And that question came up because if you have seen the documentary, you know that at one point, Monica says, I don't know what I'll say to her. She's headed for the plane. I don't know what I'll say to her when I see her. I mean, I'm not going to apologize. I can't apologize. And people were struck by that. And we had a long discussion about that. And also at the Holocaust Museum up in Skokie, where we did the same thing. People said, well, why wouldn't she apologize? And then there are other people saying, well, why should she apologize? What did she do? And so it's quite an interesting debate, and I'm going to play that out in the play with some resolution. But in a way, Helena doesn't see that Monica did anything wrong, but she wants to embrace her. And the reality off screen is that Helena was widely criticized by a lot of her friends who thought she should never have gone to do this conversation, that the children of the perpetrators are as guilty as the Nazis themselves, and they need to be punished as well. And you think about it in terms of benefits in society, and you say, well, to some extent, the kids who were alive at that time, Goering's daughter is featured there, and she looks so smug and spoiled. You have to think that she was enriched by the exclusion of an entire sector of the population. So were people benefiting from this? We look at our own society. Did people in our society benefit from the exclusion of whole groups in our society? Should they be punished as well? It's a difficult question. But Helena didn't have that attitude. She thought that Monica had done nothing wrong. She understood her pain, but she also resented some of the distorted stories that she was bringing forward, and she wanted to educate her. What I'm going to deal with in the play is the motivation for Helena to engage in this conversation. And what is that motivation? Monica, in real life, goes out and does talks at schools and that sort of thing. She's sorting her own sense of responsibility by trying to educate the coming generations. And so Helena's motivation in talking to her is to reach an audience she can't reach herself, to make sure that she's telling the story right. And for members of the Jewish community, you understand, and during Passover you have Seder, and part of the process is the experience is you bring other people into this conversation to educate them with respect to the Jewish experience. And I think we need more of that kind of dialogue, so that's going to be one of the themes.
I took a course a long time ago, history course, on Nazi Germany and pre-Nazi Germany. And I remember the professor said there was a lot of Germans that died before 1939 that thought Hitler would be the greatest thing ever. He brought them out of depression. Economically, they were much better economically than other countries. And I also remember the expression that Edmund Burke said, bad things happen when good people do nothing. And Hitler's party was 5 or 10%, whatever the small was. He never got more than 32, 33% of the popular vote prior to taking it away. And it's a mixed bag because I remember hearing a conversation in the class where they said between students, well, how could ordinary Germans do this? Professor brought up a point. What happened if those ordinary Germans were threatened, not them only, but their family? You can die. He was pointing up the fact that you could die for your beliefs. Would you be willing to have your children die for your beliefs? That's a tough that's a tough nut to crack. I don't know. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are a number of writers who've written about, you know, this notion of the banality of evil, right? That circumstances, people aren't necessarily evil, but circumstances can cause people to act in ways that are distorted. I'm going to deal with that in the play. You heard Helena refer to Amengard as a monster. I'm going to change that because I think that, and I heard a speaker from Northwestern refer to this, that in rendering stories of the Holocaust, there's a tendency to sort of by default depict the Nazis as monsters. In effect, they are not monsters, they're human beings, and in my view, that makes it even worse, okay, because these are people who are choosing to act in a certain way. It's not their nature, but they're choosing to act in a certain way, and I want to include that in a way that will be striking to people when they hear it. So here's one area where I'm taking license. But yeah, you know, we see this with respect to people we might consider to be ordinary in our own society who commit atrocities. People who are scapegoated in our societies, as the Jews were in Europe, because people had to blame somebody. And politicians, they're doing it now. In Europe, they're doing it here. You have to blame somebody for your own failings as a political leader. Right? If you can't solve the problem, then you have to point in a different direction and show that that problem is being caused by somebody else. So here's the solution. Punish those people. Get them out of the way, and that's going to improve our life. Well, you know, this gets to a fundamental question, right? What is the role of our elected officials? Should they lead or should they follow? In the democratic process, obviously, if you're elected, you certainly want to win support. Yeah. But is that necessarily leadership? And doesn't always add up that way. It's interesting too because you know the framing of the health care plan as Obamacare is a way of othering, and I'm working with a colleague now on coded language. And I looked at the last 3 presidential cycles and the slogans that were used in campaigns and some of the language that's come out in ways that subtly send a message of opposition to this person of color, who, again, if you look at the construct in this structure, has stepped out of his assigned place in our society because he doesn't belong at that top position. And so it's interesting that what we're seeing now unfold is that there are people who are opposed to Obamacare, but they support the Affordable Care Act. So if you take Obama out of it and you just talk about the elements of health care. So there you are. So it depends on how it's framed. Again, you know, what's our reality? So
I had a question, sort of, for Hitler, who used his theory of German racial superiority, that the ethnic Germans were a pure race, and Jews were also a pure race, one being apparently purely good, and the other one being apparently purely evil. How do you see the growth and manifestation of that in Hitler's ability to control, but the people's acceptance of that? To do what they did, both in the war and in their own in their war against
right.
Judaism.
Well, you know, this othering, as we call it, existed for hundreds of years. So it didn't just, you know, suddenly spring up. because of the conditions in Germany after World War I, when they needed to blame somebody, right? And the Jewish community became the target there. This has been percolating for centuries, and this whole notion of the blood libel is part of that, right? It's part of the othering. If you're familiar with this, it's this notion that Jews were kidnapping Gentiles and boiling them and babies and using their blood in rituals. This blood libel existed for some time. People believed that there was something evil about Jews. There was something to be resisted. Then you see all the depictions in Nazi art, especially of Jews in the most negative way. I have quite a collection that I use in my hate crimes class of Jews dominating the banks and that sort of thing. So again, when you're looking for a target, when you're looking for a way to excuse your own failings and find somebody else to blame, this became the convenient community to target. So it didn't just start overnight. And so the people who joined in are people who had this deep-seated belief anyway in difference. Interestingly, and this comes out in the outtakes, it also comes out in the play, in several of James Maul's documentaries, people who were victims in the Holocaust, were shocked, even though they knew that there was anti-Semitism. They were shocked at the scope of it and the dimensions of it. They were shocked that their neighbors, who had always been friends of theirs, were suddenly hating them. And you see this scene in Schindler's List, which actually appears in a documentary, the oral testimonies in the outtakes. People who lived right next door to each other were saying goodbye Jews when they were being taken away. And the compelling piece of this is that in the context of Poland, where this story takes place, Helena says, we always thought of ourselves as Polish. We just happen to be Jewish. In the case of the last days, these are people who always thought of themselves as Hungarian. They just happen to be Jewish. And so you see how this plays out. They saw themselves as part of the community, but the community always had a resistance to them because of the way they sorted that difference.
How do you reconcile the reality of the documentary, which is often kind of awkward and messy, with the audience's desire and perhaps your own desire as a writer to have a satisfying ending?
It's a good question. I'm not going to make up a happy ending, certainly, but the resolution flows organically from the story, because these are two people who obviously are searching for something. Helena goes back to Płaszów because she's searching for something, and I'm not going to give it away. But something more tangible. But she also wants the experience of reaching this person and finding something in herself. Clearly, Monica is searching for something. Is it forgiveness? Does she have a need to be blamed? What is it? And finding that thing is part of the resolution. So it's not like they go dancing off and sing Kumbaya at the end. That's not going to happen. But there's a conflict, right? And there are dimensions of this conflict. And as I find resolution in those conflicts, we at least have some level of satisfaction in the experience of going through this work. So I'm not going to invent a happy ending. It's not like that. And in fact, Helena, as I mentioned, suffered a bit just because of her participation in this, but she still feels good about the fact that she's done it. Interestingly, the same occurred with Mamie Till Mobley. I worked with Mamie Till Mobley the last 6 months of her life to make sure that her story would live on. And at the very end, that's a week before her death, I saw her during the religious holiday season, and she walked me to the door and leaned into a hug and told me that this process of delving deeply into her story and finding some meaning was cathartic. And that was the word she used. It was cathartic. And I knew that what she meant was she had been struggling with something to understand the experience herself, and a mother's sense of responsibility, right? We know 2 terrorists took Emmett away from her, and actually there were about 7 people involved in that. But a mother is still going to blame herself, in some way. She told me this, not to take it far off the Holocaust piece, but to add to your point, I went in to see her on the anniversary of Emmett's lynching. This is midway through our process. And I didn't take any notes at the time. I just wanted to visit with her. We had to sign some documents. And she was despondent when I walked in. She said, you know, people call me on this day, and they always say, you know what day this is, don't you? And she says, I don't need reminders. And if you read the book, you'll see how we deal with that. And so she went on. I didn't say anything. You know, as an interviewer, you have to know when just to shut up and listen. And so I did. And she went on to say, you know, I think about Emmett in the last moment of his life. He must have known he was going to die. As those monsters were beating him to death and torturing him, he must have known he was going to die. And I know at the very end, he cried out two names, God and Mama, and no one answered the call. And to me, that helped to frame the arc of that story, right? That what we had here was not just this story of a death that sparks the civil rights movement, but we have a mother's journey to justice and something more, because that cathartic note was the payoff for it all, right? That she was trying to find forgiveness for herself, and she finally had in going through this story. So I think that's what we have with the inheritance piece as well. Two people who are searching for something that they can walk away with and find satisfy some need that they have. And the need of Helena is to sort this thing out, to talk it through, to actually meet the daughter of this man who brutalized her, who tortured her and killed thousands of people personally. You know, shot them from his balcony or lined them up and shot them. I mean, just horrible atrocities that you'll see unfold in the documentary. So she had to find that for herself, and the same is true with Monica. And I don't know where Monica is now in terms of her own emotional development, but she needed that conversation as well. She needed to meet Helena to have that conversation and to say, as she says in the even in the trailer, you know, I want her to know that I'm not like my father. You know, so to the extent that she was able to convey that and to walk away believing that Helena doesn't see her as her father is a point of satisfaction. Is it a small thing? Well, as a writer, I can take a small thing and make it bigger. So I talk a lot, don't I? I'm told I talk a lot.
How is it that Monica contacted Helena? Did she do that totally on her own, or was something else at work that helped them get together?
Yeah, good question. It comes through in the documentary as well. She, you know, there's a walkthrough. The documentarian, James Mall, sets it all up. She first saw Schindler's List, and she saw the portrayal of this person she had heard about. Her grandmother had told her that there was someone who had been brought in the house, and she didn't really think about it until she saw the rendering in the movie, the young girl who's brought into the house of the commandant. Then when Schindler's List is promoted in Germany, there's a documentary that's done, and they actually interview Helena in the documentary. So she had heard about this person from her grandmother, then saw the depiction in the film, and now she's actually seeing her in real life in an interview, and she said, I have to meet this person. So she wrote to her. It was completely on her own. James Mall became sort of the conduit for this. I mean, they were promoting Schindler's List at some point. He was the founding executive director of Shoah. Helena's oral testimony is included in the Shoah archives, so he knew her. Somehow, Monica reached out to him, and he gave the letter to Helena. Yeah. She didn't want to do it at first. They had to ask her a couple of times, and she finally relented.
Early in your PowerPoint, you identified the formations, the duality formation, the good and the evil, and that sets this up. And these people confront that duality and choose not to be enslaved by that duality. And you perch us now at the point where we have to ask the question is, when does duality fall apart? And I think you're answering that question. The next question is, then what?
Well, we sort of test our scripts, don't we, for life in this process. And a lot of this happens on college campuses. We see a lot of tension on college campuses, but that's kind of a natural thing. Many people are encountering people they've never had any personal contact with, and they're sort of discovering each other. And out of that, we hope we have better relations. But one of the things that we try to teach in the courses I have developed is that we have learned to see difference in oppositional ways. But we don't have to do that. That's a choice. And if you're enlightened, you step back and you understand this process, you can make a different choice. And that choice is to see difference as a value. So this whole notion of color blindness is I think unnecessary. We can see difference. Babies see difference. There has been research that shows that a baby will recognize difference, right? You recognize those people who are familiar to you and those people who are different to you. It's a natural mechanism to determine whether this is somebody who's going to feed me or somebody's going to have me for lunch, right? So it's a survival technique. And over the course of time, that difference is informed through all the social structures, through our family. If you're a mother and you're holding your baby in your arms in an elevator and somebody who looks different gets on the elevator and you tense up, that communicates something to the baby, right? So it starts just that early. What we need to do is re-educate ourselves and find difference, that the experiential reality of people who are different from us, who've had a different lived experience, is of value to us. It helps us to understand our place in society by understanding every other person and their experience as well. We become much more informed, we become much more engaged, and I think we're going to make much more enlightened decisions. So it can be done, and I've seen it happen with students. Some of the students who've come into my hate crimes class are not necessarily inclined to accept the things that they ultimately accept just because I present it to them in a way that's not threatening, not judgmental, and they begin to process it. My theory is that if you spent your life adding up 2 + 2 and coming up with 5, and I show you a different formula, you're going to recalibrate. And I think that's what we need to do.
In Germany and in the U.S. and in Europe, Jews were scapegoated in Europe. Blacks have been mistreated and exploited in the U.S. and in most of the Americas. In a slightly different situation, you have in, say, Iraq, in Rwanda, in Syria, which hasn't been sorted out, you have a minority group who actually did lean on the majority and exploit them. And now in Rwanda and still fluid in Iraq, the majority has gained power, if not, in perhaps the upper hand. How does that sort? I should mention South Africa too. Just different thing, but I know they had the reconciliation commissions there, but what do you see that? How would you see that playing out?
You mean numerical majorities and minorities?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it ultimately is about power. So whoever has the power ultimately can control how this thing plays out, right? Because I look at it now in a power construct. Early on in my work, I was looking at race because that was my point of entry. But, in playing it out logically, I couldn't continue to support a racial construct for everything. One example is when people asked me, well, okay, you talk about white supremacy in connection with Emmett Till. What about when you have cases of black-on-black crime? What about these cases we see in certain urban spaces where these young people are killing each other? And I had to rethink it because what I discovered is it really flows from the same thing. It's still in this power construct. If we have defined certain people in our society as worthless, right, that supports what I was saying in the past is sort of a white power narrative. That also plays to the way young kids see each other. They see themselves as devalued. Life has no value, and so it's easier to destroy life, and that's the consistent piece of it. So it's not necessarily about majority and minority. It's about ultimately who holds the power, and you see that in Central Africa. Certainly, you see it in the Balkans, and other places as well. It's easier if you have the majority because you have, in a democratic process, at least some support, but it's not always democratic, is it? So. Does that address your question?
Maybe not quite. I was thinking more of, do you see any way that these things can work out, that people
Yeah. I don't have all the answers in that regard. But what I said earlier still applies. You know, I think in our society, at least, we have the opportunity to engage in discourse and to reach a point of enlightenment where we can make different choices. I know that's possible because I've seen it happen in the classrooms where students come in with all kinds of ideas, and ultimately they develop a framework for, I think, reaching better conclusions. I can't say if that is effective in all societies, but it certainly has. I've seen it work in ours. So. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. If they make different choices than you, do you ever accept their choices? Yeah, well, I don't judge. So. But I mean, not judge. I mean, do you ever accept their choices? Yeah, I mean, you know, that's part of the dynamic process of teaching is that you do learn as well. I can give you two quick examples. You know, in my hate crimes class, I have different modules, and one of the modules, after we set the framework for analyzing ethnoviolence, is a series of screenings of documentaries and motion pictures. And one of the pictures I include is Milk, because I want to help the students understand the construction of sexuality and how it's enforced violently often. And one class, one semester, I set it up by saying, okay, so these are certain things that I want you to think about, and among them is how do we feel about same-sex, you know, intimacy on the screen. And a student in her essay wrote to me and said, well, you know, that was a heteronormative reference. I happen to be lesbian, and that marginalized me. And I said, oh, okay, well, I didn't think about that at the time, because what I was suggesting is that people in the LGBT community also might have a level of discomfort in seeing that portrayal because of the pushback that it might cause. But I didn't think that through as I was explaining it. So I learned something from her in that moment about myself and the carelessness of my reference. Another one was sort of similar issue. I was walking to class one day with my TA, and he said, you know, there's this new thing that's going around. It's no homo. I said, no homo, what is that? Now, we're on our way to class, this particular class. And he said, well, when, you know, heterosexual guys say something that's sensitive to other guys, they punctuate it by saying, you know, hey, I like the way I like your suit today, no homo, in a way that says that is not an expression of affection, just a recognition of the style or something. So I said, oh, I'm going to use that. And I did in that class, where this guy on the front row had a interesting T-shirt on. So throughout my lecture, I just kept looking back at him, and I said, you know what, wait, I got to stop right here. I just want to tell you, I really dig that T-shirt you're wearing. No homo. 80 students started laughing, so it showed that they all recognized that. Now, this is after the screening of Milk, when I get all these sensitive essays where students are saying, you know, I have a cousin, I have a friend, I know about these things, and I think we should change the way we look at it. Okay, so all these sensitive essays about the LGBT community, yet they laughed at that reference. And I said, wait a minute, why are we laughing at that? And we began to unpack it. And they came to realize that in just laughing at that joke, they're participating in the marginalization, because they're supporting people who are saying, you know, it's all right. It was like the Seinfeld joke. We're not gay, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But to say that suggests that there's something wrong with it because you're saying you're not that. And in that process, I think they got something. A week later, one of the students came to class and said, Professor, I just want to tell you this. We were all at the bar the other night, and one of our friends said, no homo. And we stopped right there and had a conversation about that. So. I'm glad you brought. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's one of the challenges I face in writing the play, and that is where's the humor? Where can I find the humor? And I've said this at other presentations. One was at the Holocaust Museum in Skokie. And as I said, there were like 250 people out there. I said, you know, what I'm trying to do is find humor. And I see some people going, no way. And some people saying, okay, yeah, fine. And the reason is because, you know, as a creative person, I've got to capture the full range of emotions, right? So it's natural that you would have pain. You would have guilt and a sense of responsibility, but they're also, if you're going to complete the framing of these people, there should be some humor somewhere. That's not to minimize the Holocaust and its impact. It's simply to capture the humanity of it and to connect people with people in order to understand what was lost in a deeper way. So stay tuned, and you'll see how I deal with that as well. So.
We have to wrap it up, but I have one last question.
Okay.
Where are you in the writing process? When is it going to be done, and where will the play open?
Okay, all these are good questions. I'm halfway through, but it's talking to me now. I've had all these interruptions, and now I'm working on it apace. And so I'm halfway through the second act, and I know where the rest of it's going, so hopefully soon. The people at the Krannert Center for the Performing Arts at the University of Illinois have committed to workshopping and developing it. So once I have a draft, they'll dramaturg it and assign me to different teams, the media team for the backdrop and the scene construction, set construction and costuming and that sort of thing. And the good thing about that is that a lot of these are the same people who were part of the development and workshopping of Moises Kaufman's 33 Variations, which premiered at the Krannert Center, then went on to the arena stage in Washington and then to New York. I'm not saying, but it's nice to have that level of talent and insight involved in the process. So where it goes after that, I don't know. But my only thought is to at least have it performed and to have discussions about what people get out of the experience and to hopefully cause some different thinking. So thank you. Thank you very much.